and welcome to Weighed in the Balance, the show where we examine to see if claims can stand up to scrutiny. Today I am joined by Mr. Matt Duraski. Matt is a teaching elder, that's minister for everybody else, in the Presbyterian Church in America, and one of my friends from seminary, and he and I actually had the opportunity to take a class from a guy named Carl Trueman on Martin Luther. And so today we are going to be looking at some statements about Martin Luther that really just, well, it didn't sound right. So let's, Matt, is there anything you want to say to introduce yourself before we jump in?
Just thanks for having me on. I was really looking forward to this, and I was looking forward to having this conversation. I think it's further proof positive that the Reformed and the Lutherans have a sort of a unrequited love on one end. The Reformed tend to love the Lutherans, and the feeling isn't always mutual. But I am happy to correct misunderstandings about Martin Luther. I do not consider myself a Luther expert, but I guess I know more than the maybe average churchgoer about Martin Luther and about that period of history. It's important to me because I think it obviously has a lot to say about justification, and really the core of the gospel comes out a lot during that particular historical period. So I'm really excited to talk about it. Thanks for having me on, Jonathan.
Yeah, well, so but before we get to the clip, actually that's a good point that you make, that like Luther is not even really our guy per se as Reformed Christians. We definitely have a lot of respect for Luther and are certainly thankful for a lot of the insights that he had. But like, you don't study Martin Luther for, shall we say, theological precision. He was, well, he had a big mouth.
Yeah, I love the people online who say that Martin Luther would have been really, really good at social media, because that's probably true.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that, I also think, if I could just go off for half a second, I think Luther is underrated as a theologian. I think that people don't really respect the fact that Luther he is a fire breather to some extent. And certainly later in his life, he had a reputation for being quite, shall we say, grouchy. But people really underestimate the depth of his thinking. He's not just some crazy reactionary the way that the Roman Church typically personifies him as. He's a man who has a deep love for God and a love for his word. And so, is he the highest, smartest doctor of the church? Probably not. But is he a deep thinker who helps people understand Jesus better? I think definitely yes.
Yeah, so that is a good balance. I'm reminded of Dr. Carroll always said you need to be as balanced as the Bible is balanced, and you need to, yes, when looking at history, you need to be as balanced as the figure in question was balanced. Because like, if you start quoting Luther when he's railing against somebody, like, Google against the Roman papacy, an institution of the devil, and you will find some statements in there that I would not endorse, right? He was going off while he was angry, and he said a lot of stuff that he probably shouldn't have. On the Jews and their lies is another example. But then you look at the Small Catechism, and whatever qualms I would have as a Presbyterian, I can look at this and see, oh, this is a man who was concerned about the spiritual health, particularly of the laity in the churches that had embraced the Reformation. By that point, it was clear that Rome was not going to be on board with the Reformation movement. And so Luther really needed to develop something so that the people could know the Ten Commandments, the Apostles' Creed, and the Lord's Prayer. And especially the Apostles' Creed, he'll confess these rich truths of the Christian faith, and then it'll just end with, this is most certainly true. And it's just this most uplifting thing to read, which from Luther, like, I'm used to going to Luther for, like, nobody understood what sin was quite like Luther did, right? Nobody understood how you need to oppose false teachers quite like Luther did. And he perhaps even at some points went to an extreme. But then Luther also has this very pastoral side as well that a lot of people miss. And I think when you talk about Luther, it is very easy to fall on one side or the other. And I think that this gentleman, his name is Alex Jurado. I hope I'm saying that right.
Jurado, jurado, something like that. I don't know if that J is pronounced or not.
I don't know either, and I've never heard him say his name. He's just always
Yeah.
the voice of reason guy.
Yeah,
But
and when you're, as we're moving into him, let me also say I think a good thing to say in terms of transitioning into the actual substance of what we're going to talk about today. Luther is also someone whose views develop over time. That is so crucial for understanding him and for understanding the Reformation. Luther progresses in his theology as the years go on. It's not as if the Martin Luther from 17 is the same Martin Luther from 1520. I did not pick those dates on accident. We'll talk about that in a minute. And it's not as if the Luther from 1520 is the same Luther that was still writing a decade later. He has a lot of progression to his theology, which is very important to keep in mind as we move into this clip.
yeah. Well, let's take a look at, this is actually on a channel of a guy named Ruslan, which I think that he is some flavor of charismatic. So I guess for us, both of these guys are kind of outside of the theological tradition that we run in, but so we might agree or disagree with even things that Ruslan says, but I actually think he does a fairly good job here. And anyway, let's take a look at the clip.
So Martin Luther, his problem was with the abuses of indulgences.
Charging money for them.
And the Catholic Church said Martin Luther was not trying to just change, ecclesial traditions that he thought were not necessary. He wasn't just trying to change human apostolic traditions because there were none left to change. Yeah. He was trying to change. You have to
And
deal with the
so
consequences
if I go
of the
do a
liver,
bunch
right?
of Hail Marys, those consequences are remitted for me?
Only one of Martin Luther's 95 Theses that has an anathema attached to it. It's the only one where he says, you're anathematized if you reject this. Do you know what that was? What was it?
Ruslan.
When Luther comes
That was a great intro there. I'm just going to.
That was good, yeah.
Yeah. All right. So he said, when Luther comes along,
in the scene, this is, and again, my understanding is that he's looking at it and he's like, hey, there's been drift into some very hairy territory where the accusation, and I know you guys have a response to this, but the indulgences, the selling of these things, let me get this out.
Yeah.
And so he's going, hey, we need to stop this.
Right.
And he wasn't trying to start another church. He was trying to reform the Catholic Church. So what's your view of Luther in terms of, like, there's some sketchy stuff going on, of some sketchy, you call them naughty
the naughty popes?
the naughty popes,
Right?
yeah. And we don't got to go into the naughty popes,
Right.
but what is your impression of someone coming on the scene and going, hey, I love God. I love the Word. We want to get the Word into people's hands, right? And when I go to the Word, I see a pretty big discrepancy between what Jesus and the apostles taught in the Bible, which you view as inspired in God's Word, right? Versus the practice that I'm seeing today and how people are being treated today with these indulgences and the stuff that's happening. We need to reform the Catholic Church and go back to what the apostles started. Like, how?
all right. So I realize we didn't actually get to what Alex is saying, but is that a fair sort of synopsis of how the Reformation got started?
I think in general, yeah. You're talking about the host, Ruslan, his summary, right?
Yeah.
So I think that is a pretty good kind of 30,000-foot view of what Martin Luther was trying to accomplish. Luther, he really wasn't trying to form a new church. As a matter of fact, he hated Lutheran. He hated that as a term. I should say a second generation of reformers. John Calvin hated the term Calvinism because these men understood themselves not to be creating theology out of whole cloth. They saw themselves as recovering theology from the past. And that's something really important to keep in mind. A lot of Catholics misunderstand this. A lot of Protestants misunderstand this. Protestant church does not say, oh, well, the church was doing great until the year about 200. And then from 200, 300, 400, wherever you want to put it, from that century till the 1500s, church didn't matter. And then Martin Luther came along and made everything better. That is a gross misunderstanding and a very common misunderstanding of what Protestantism is. So I think the guy is right to say Luther was not trying to be necessarily a revolutionary. He wanted to be a reformer in the truest sense of that term. Now, did Luther lean into a bit of the drama of it? Maybe, but it's not as if he's saying, all right, it's time for a new church. You know, that's not what he's saying.
Yeah, when you described the common misconception, all I could think was that sounds roughly like what I grew up with. So I was raised independent Baptist, and there is a view amongst certain Baptists, I don't know if you've heard of it, but it gets called Landmark Baptist or Lighthouse Baptist. If you ever hear somebody reference a pamphlet called The Trail of Blood.
Yeah. I was going to ask about that one.
Yeah. So the view is that Jesus and the apostles were all Baptists and that the early church was all Baptists. But then Constantine came along and wanted to use Christianity for his own political ends. And so a lot of the good Baptists ended up forsaking that and becoming Catholics. And that's where the Catholic Church comes from. But the good Baptists, they went underground, and so they will point to different heretical groups during the late patristic and medieval period. Yeah.
That's not good.
When you're pointing to the Donatists as like, those are our people, not a good thing.
Yeah, bad luck.
When you're pointing to the Albigensians and saying, those are us. No, Albigensians did not reject infant baptism. They rejected water baptism because they were Gnostic heretics.
Yeah.
But
and I think that it's interesting. I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but it's interesting that the Trail of Blood is this sort of infamous historical revisionism of sorts. And no less than Charles Spurgeon was a citer of the Trail of Blood. I love Charles Spurgeon, love me some Spurgeon, but I think there's a certain temptation to legitimize yourself that can lead you to some ahistorical places, which I would say that a lot of Roman Catholicism does that. A lot of Roman Catholicism would say that I do that. But we're all kind of in search of confirmation of our own preconceptions or assumptions or presuppositions even, if you will. However, that being said, I think that it's important to let the historical record speak for itself. And I think this is paraphrasing Cormac McCarthy, but it is what it is. It isn't what you want it to be. And that's very important, especially considering the work of theology. I don't mean to get too off track here, but one of the reasons that I am not Catholic now is because I think that a lot of Catholicism will retrospectively read their current history into the past, or like their contemporary history into the past. And I think when I read the New Testament, and I have an interest in New Testament canon, so I'm weird. I read these like extra biblical books because I don't know, I have nothing better to do, I guess. And I read stuff like that, and I see Christian communities working out their theology, working out their salvation with fear and trembling, so to speak. What I don't see is a bunch of affirmations of Catholic theology that the Roman Church has insisted has existed all along. I don't see that. I just don't think it exists. And we have to go by what the historical record shows us. We don't get to pick and choose what's important.
yeah, but that's where the view that I was raised in, where, you know, it's always been Baptist all the way down the line, and kind of the Roman/Eastern view are sort of like weird kind of negative images of each other.
Yeah.
Where the idea is that, like, well, if this wasn't sort of very neat and tidy, then we have a real problem. Whereas in our view of church history, like I had somebody ask me one time, I won't say what was happening that was frustrating me, but there was something in the church that was happening that was frustrating me. Anybody who has served in any church for any period of time will know that happens. And this guy asked me, he said, does it make you discouraged about the visible church? And I said, well, man, I gotta be honest. It's difficult for me to be discouraged about the visible church today when, like, I believe the visible church didn't die out in the Middle Ages. Like,
No.
when there's stories of, like, dudes taking the Lord's Supper home to, like, put it in their beehive so his bees will make more honey. And have you heard this story?
I've not heard that one before.
So the legend is that he put the host in his beehive thinking that the bees would make more honey, and he comes out the next day and there's no bees buzzing. He's like, what on earth is going on? So he takes the top off the beehive, and they've made a little chapel, and they're all in church. And
that's funny. It's a cute story. It's a cute story.
It is. And it shows the kind of superstition that developed in the Middle Ages. And there were all sorts of abuses. There were popes with like 10 kids at certain times. Like,
there's a, I don't think that this is actually true, but I think there was a rumor that Machiavelli himself, of the Prince fame, was the illegitimate child of a pope. And I don't bring that up to say he definitely was that. It's to say it is plausible that that rumor could exist.
yeah. Well, and like look at Oversimplified's video on the bucket war, where he talks about that, where they're rolling dice in the Vatican, you know,
Yeah.
first red flag, and
Yeah.
come on, Zeus. Sorry, I meant Thor.
That's pretty good.
Like
Also,
that,
for that, well, sorry, go ahead.
no, like that was the state of the church in the Middle Ages, but I don't believe the church ceased to exist. And so
No.
it gets really murky. But to our point, Luther and Melanchthon and Butzer and Oecolampadius and Calvin and all of these guys, they were never wanting to found a new church. It's not that the church ceased to exist and they're refounding it. They are seeking to reform the church according to Scripture.
And as one of our professors put it, and this has always kind of stuck out in my mind, Reformation theology is not meant to be a new thing. It's not meant to be a departure from traditional theology. What it is meant to be is meat and potatoes. It is meant to be your standard, relatively uncontroversial, just let's get back down to the absolute basics. Let's get to a, in that illustration, meat and potatoes is not fancy eating, but it's nutritious and it gets the job done. And if, a lot of the time it tastes good. And that's kind of what Reformation theology seeks to be. It seeks to be a simplification. So you're talking about the visible church. My understanding is the Reformed world generally agrees that Catholicism and Orthodoxy are part of the visible church. We don't deny that. We say that they're part of the visible church. But the difference is we say that those things have metastasized. They've grown beyond their foundation in a way that ultimately ends up betraying their foundation. They've grown almost beyond Scripture, as it were. And as Protestants, we say that that's our rule of faith and practice. We don't want to go past that. We think that is an appropriate God-given stopping point for our theology, is what is contained in Scripture itself.
So since that actually came up at the review of Presbytery Records last week, I do have to give my slightly different take on that.
Okay.
I don't consider Rome to be part of the visible church, according to the Westminster definition, because that is all of those who confess the true faith and their children. However, what I do believe is that there can be members of the invisible church within that church, and it is incumbent upon them to leave that church because it's a false church. So Rome is very complicated, because I also accept Roman Catholic baptism, but I don't believe it's a valid part of, in other words, if someone is a Baptist, do I think they should not be a Baptist? Yes. But is it perilous to their soul to be a Baptist? I wouldn't say so. Whereas Rome is kind of in that category of, it is actually very perilous for you to be a part of this communion.
Yeah, this is something that I've gone over with people in my church before. The real difficulty on it is complicated, first of all. And before I forget, let me just say, it is of note to me that Luther and Calvin were never rebaptized. They were baptized as Catholics, never sought to get another baptism. But anyway, that aside, here's kind of where the challenge is. We have degrees of theological disagreement. I don't know if this is just a Presbyterian thing. I don't think it is. There's the Theological Triage book that's going around right now that's very popular, talks about this. But even before that was published, we were learning this in seminary, that there's sort of three categories of theological disagreement. There's primary issues, stuff like the divinity of Jesus, justification by faith, the existence of the Trinity, the second coming. Those things are first-tier theological issues. If you do not affirm these things, you cannot meaningfully be called a Christian. There's second-tier stuff, secondary issues, things like baptism. If you are a believers-only baptism, you can't be a Presbyterian. I'm sorry, it just doesn't work that way.
Or at least an officer in the Presbyterian church.
Correct. And so these are things that sort of divide by denomination. And then third, there are things that are tertiary issues. Tertiary issues do not necessarily mean that people don't feel strongly about them, because one of my go-to examples of a tertiary issue is the consumption of alcohol, which people feel very strongly about that one, but ultimately it's not even something that you have to separate by denomination. We have people in our church that are teetotalers. We have people in our church that do consume alcohol. We can coexist if we allow each other to coexist.
Yeah.
The reason I bring all this up is merely to say that the challenging thing about the Roman Church and the challenging thing about the Church of the East is that there does appear to be a first-tier issue in justification with these churches. And that presents a challenge for us because on the one hand, we do have things in common with Roman Catholics and with the Orthodox. We affirm the Trinity. We affirm the dual nature of Jesus. We affirm, to some extent, the work of grace in God's economy to save people. We can agree on those things. Maybe that last one's a little funny, but we can generally agree. However, justification becomes the sticking point. And there's almost like in my mind, a like 1.5, and I don't know exactly how it breaks down. I
was going to suggest that, by the way, that it's almost like Rome, like it doesn't get all the way into that first tier, but it's not secondary either. It is it's in between, which is why I'm willing to say that if somebody wanted to join this church and they were baptized Roman Catholic, I wouldn't say you needed to get baptized again.
I agree. Yeah.
But at the same time, I can't regard the Roman church as a valid church because what are the marks of the church? Well, it's the word rightly preached.
And
the
correct.
Sacraments rightly administered. Also no.
Nope.
And discipline rightly enforced.
No. Nope.
No.
You know, this is something of a tangent, but it's always struck me as somewhat amusing. I don't mean to be condescending, but somewhat amusing that in the Western church, we like fight about doctrine like just at the drop of a hat, right? I mean, the whole Martin Luther controversy is a good example of that, actually. We're willing to fight over theology all day long. In the Eastern church, they fight less about theology as such. Now, I'm not an expert on orthodoxy, but I have some experience. And it almost becomes less about specific theologies and almost more about recognition of authority. So throughout the history of orthodoxy, you'll find that like they're much more comfortable than Catholics or Protestants on the idea of universal justification. So or universal salvation, I should say.
Yeah.
They're pretty comfortable with saying, yeah, everybody's in heaven. Well, Jesus' blood was effective for everybody. They kind of pull the trigger on the implication of universal atonement, where they say, if the atonement's universal, it covers everybody. We in the West are like, no, that can't be the case because we don't think Hitler's in heaven, for example.
Yeah.
Or Stalin or whatever.
You might have this in mind, but Callistos Ware in the Orthodox Church, I suppose I'm thankful for the distinction that he makes, but it's sort of, the distinction he makes is that he said, it's okay to think that everyone might be saved. You just can't say that it's certain that everybody will, but like, I can totally hope that everybody, might be.
Yeah. And they're much more comfortable with that. But the funny thing is, what they don't tolerate at all is like if you don't recognize a bishop that they think is the right bishop. If you do not recognize Father so-and-so from some obscure part of Greece or whatever, you will get excommunicated faster than you can sneeze.
Yeah,
and to me,
if you said that you shouldn't have icons in your church.
Yeah, you would be just kicked out in half a second. But anyway, to bring that back to Rome, the thing that is so important for us as Protestants to realize is that, like you're saying, Luther is not trying to make a new church, first of all. He is not trying to do that. But second of all, as he's trying to reform, what he's trying to do is that ad fontes mindset, right? He's trying to say, let's get back to what we said in the first place. Let's not get out there and start to tack things on to our theology that don't need to be there. The gentleman in the podcast that I suppose we'll get back to, Alex. I'm going to call him Alex because I'm not confident in his last name. But he actually brings up towards the end of the clip that you've got pulled up there, one of my pet peeves as a Protestant, which is the 44,000 denominations thing. And that is like my least favorite argument in the world because it is so obviously in bad faith. And do you mind if I go off on this for like half a second?
No. Go for it.
So I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about this as an American Presbyterian. And it really drove home to me that, okay, yeah, we can admit, I don't have a problem admitting this, that there are a lot of Protestant denominations. That is true. Okay, let's not be disingenuous about that. But we need to ask, why do those exist before we immediately start assuming these exist for a bad reason?
Mm-hmm.
For example, our Presbyterian tradition. Why does the PCA exist? Well, it's honestly because of civil problems and because of history. The PCA exists because initially there was a split between the Northern and Southern Presbyterian churches here in the United States of America. Now, why did that happen?
1861.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, you might be asking yourself, why did that happen right then? It wasn't because all the Presbyterians got in a room and started arguing with each other. It's because there was kind of a big political environment that had been created in the United States at that time.
What happened in 1861?
I know, yeah.
Yeah. Somebody's going to watch this and they're going to be like, what?
What did happen? Yeah. Yeah. Well, being from Georgia, being from about an hour south of Atlanta, I can tell you I'm very well acquainted with what happened in 1861. But out of that, you get the Northern and Southern Presbyterian Church, which only exist because of historical realities and not because of theological slap fighting. And then over time, you get the Northern Church liberalizes first. And so out of the Northern Church, you get the OPC, you get the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. The Southern Church takes a little longer to liberalize, and I'm skipping a lot here. But in 1973, you get the PCA. The PCA and the OPC are extremely similar denominations. And so right then and there, you have four different denominations. You have the Southern Church, the Northern Church, the OPC, the PCA, that exist largely because of history and because of liberalization, not because we're just so crazy and we're just making stuff up. Now, that does not apply to every single Protestant denomination. There are some Protestant denominations, Seventh-day Adventists come to mind, who kind of are making things up. I guess if any Seventh-day Adventists are watching this, sorry. But at the same time, that is an aberrant theology. However, people who come from the Roman perspective act like every single Protestant division is because of controversy that wouldn't exist if they had an overarching hierarchical power structure. And that is patently untrue. That is not the case at all. Well, there are plenty of historical realities that push people into different denominations, or geographical realities, or just the fact that a bunch of guys want to get together and have a Bible study. They're not necessarily in conflict with all these other denominations. Catholicism acts like it's chaos, and it's not.
Yeah, well, the example that I've used is like, so you and I both have good friends who are in the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church. Why today, and there's historical considerations as to why they were separated in the first place, the PCA and the ARP. It's stuff in Scotland, and then they came over here. Summarizing a story, like, I'm giving you the really short version of that story. But today, why are the PCA and the ARP separate? It's one word: Bonclarken. It is the...
Yeah, that's true.
It's the retreat that the ARP has in Western North Carolina that they don't want to give up. Because that's... And for guys in the ARP, that's a very sentimental feeling that they have towards that place, where they're like, this is where we fought the battles against liberalism in our own church. This is where we've come for synod every year for how many decades. Like, this is who we are, and they don't want to give that up. Whereas, I mean, if the PCA did joining and receiving with the ARP, then we would be like, we have Rich Haven. Like, we don't need Bonclarken. And so, is that kind of a dumb reason to be separate? We could take sides on that, I suppose, but we're still in full fraternal fellowship with the ARP. Like, I think I can administer the sacraments in an ARP congregation.
Really? I did actually not know that.
Yeah, well, because when I was working in an ARP congregation, there was a member who wanted his daughter baptized by a PCA minister, and so he came in and performed the baptism in the ARP congregation. So, like, that's the level of fellowship that we have with one another.
Yeah, and I think it's disingenuous to say that because two groups are separate, they must be at war with each other. That's just kind of assuming your premise a little bit. And I think that that's a great example. I mean, we're going to have General Assembly in maybe 20-ish days here in the PCA, and we will receive fraternal delegates from the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, from the OPC, from the ARP, from all the different, what they call the NAPARC denominations, North American Reformed Presbyterian. Did I get that right? I'm not sure. Got that right.
Yeah, it's like North American Presbyterian and Reformed churches.
Yes, that's what it is.
Yeah.
We are in full agreement that those guys are pretty much like one step over from us. And we don't have a fight with each other. We're not trying to beat each other up, or at least I don't think a lot of people are trying to beat each other up in these sort of cross-denominational discussions. And so for people from kind of the Roman church or Roman persuasion to look at us and say, well, 44,000 denominations exist, that must be conflict. That must be people arguing. It's not. Like you said, there are historical reasons that the ARP exists, and we haven't joined together yet, but who knows what the Lord will do in the future. But even if we don't come together in full, and become one denomination, even if we don't do that, we are still very much in agreement with each other. And for that matter, I like to tell people at my church here, I'm gesturing this way because my pulpit's about 10 yards through the wall, but I'm not angry at the Baptists for being Baptists. I'm really not. I don't agree with them on the sacrament, and I wish that they would see it differently, but that doesn't stop them from being my brothers. I mean, I have a great friend of mine from college, a pair of brothers actually. They are as Baptist as the day is long. Actually, one of them is now no longer Baptist, long story, but at the time I knew them, they were super Baptist. We prayed together, we read scripture together, we had Bible studies together, we were in each other's homes all the time. There is nothing stopping us from being friends.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to kind of go off on this for so long, but the 44,000 denominations argument assumes that we are all in conflict with one another always. And that if only we had a big tent imposed theology on our churches, if only that existed, we would have no chaos at all. We'd have unity. We'd have a fraternal delegation with everybody. But that's just not true to reality. It's not true to history.
Yeah.
And certainly, as the Roman Church has moved on, they have tightened their grip on authority. As a matter of fact, within the last 300 years or so, the papacy has gotten even stronger in the way that they talk about it. Is it as politically, what's the word I'm looking for? Is the papacy as politically expedient as it used to be? No, because frankly, the church and state got separated in the 800s, more or less, in the West. However, that did not result in the Pope saying, well, I have less power now. No, actually, two believing Catholics, he's tightened his grip. You know, a lot of the papal declarations from, say, 1800 on have been about how great the papacy is. And then, I know that this is not the nicest thing in the world, but it is at least true in my evaluation that the Pope will assume greater authority for himself and then go back and say, well, it's always been this way, right? And I just think it's very disingenuous. I mean, ask an Orthodox Christian from the East. Ask him, well, is the Pope's authority greater or lesser than it used to be? Because until 1054, 1054, Great Schism, right?
Yes.
In 1054, the Eastern Church had enough, and they moved on because they felt that the Bishop of Rome had accrued too much power to himself. To me, that's very telling about where the papacy is today.
Yeah, I would love to go further down that rabbit hole of the papacy. We do need to get back to the
we do. I'm sorry.
clip at some point, but so. With Luther, the other thing that I want to point out, sort of piggybacking off of what Ruslan said, not only was he not trying to start a new church, but as you pointed out, Luther was not like a static individual. Like what Luther thinks is what Luther thinks. Luther definitely had a progression, and everybody knows the story of him being caught in the lightning storm, right? And by his own accounting, lightning struck right next to where he was standing, and he was scared for his life, and so he cried out for help to Jesus's grandmother. And
Saint Anne, help me, I will become a monk.
Yes. And then during his time as a monk, he has this whole crisis of his soul, which I think must have already been happening. Like, why would you be making promises like that unless you were scared that, like, the lightning was going to strike you because God was going to smite you? So I think he was already having that sort of crisis of conscience already. But then as he is a monk, by his own accounting, he tried to be the best monk that he could. If he had to pray for 1 hour, he prayed for 2. If he had to fast for 2 days, he fasted for 3. He did everything he was supposed to and more. But he never found that peace of mind. In 1517, he still has not found that peace of mind. He has not had what he describes as his mountaintop experience, where he sees the gospel in the book of Romans. In 1517, what he sees is the poor are getting robbed, and this is wrong.